If you have wondered what happens inside of a podcast strategy intensive, today is the day. We're going to talk through what it is, why we launched this offer, and why this work is some of the most important work you can do, whether it's with me or someone else. But we're going to talk about how we do it inside of an intensive. Here we go. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. Welcome. Another episode of the More Profitable Podcast. I do not get sick of saying that. I am going to be completely transparent with you. This is a breakdown of an offer. This is, and you've maybe seen the episode where we talk about this, but this is an audio sales page. This is me walking you through what happens inside of a podcast strategy intensive, why they exist, why they're important. Because and again, full transparency, think it's really important to have these components in your podcast. It's really important for you to have episodes like this. This is one of the most I was going to say this is one of the most frequent, but honest to goodness, this may be the episode style we talk about in every intensive, because this is a critical sales piece that I want you to have. And so for no other reason than kind of hearing what this episode can be structured like, I want you to listen to today's episode. But if you're somebody who has been thinking about working with us, but you're just not quite ready to jump in a contract with production, this is an incredible first step, because we create a lot together so that you can then go and just implement alone. It's big. It's huge. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through what the sales process looks like. We're going to walk through what the actual intensive process looks like. And then I'm going to tell you a couple of things some people have said after having done podcast strategy intensives with me. And then we're going to talk about how you can get yours booked too. Before we jump into that, I want to remind you, we have a brand new episode of the Podcast Newsroom coming out like literally the day this episode is live. There's also a brand new episode. It's a two for today. There's also a brand new episode of the Podcast Newsroom. And if you've not yet subscribed to the Podcast Newsroom, you're going to want to. Not just for today's episode, but for our new monthly feature. So fun. Are actually sitting down with a listener and talking through an audit. Honestly, not dissimilar than the audit that we do for the podcast strategy intensive, but we'll talk about that in a hot minute. But we've started rolling those episodes out, and so you can hear what it looks like to have one of those done and find out how to subscribe. These are exclusive to the Podcast Newsroom, and Podcast Newsroom subscribers always get priority and approval when we start batch recording these, and we're going to be batch recording another set here shortly. So make sure your information is in, because I only have a couple spots left for our next run. All of that is at thepodcastnewsroom.com. So go grab your feed. Let's dig into this. Let's talk about the podcast strategy intensive. I rolled out the podcast strategy intensive in the fall of 2022 because I was finding that for some podcasters, production was a really big commitment for them. They just weren't yet in a place in their show where that made sense. There were still too many moving pieces. There were still too many pieces of uncertainty, and or their show was just too far from delivering the ROI that they would need to commit to 12 months of production with Uncommonly More, which is how we package our production services. If you're not sure what production with us looks like, head over to the show notes and I'll have a link to the What Working with Uncommonly More episode looks like. That is where we talk all about podcast production with us. But I was getting some emails and I was getting some questions about what would it look like to just have strategy session with you? And at the time, I would sort of open and close 1 hour, sort of one-off single session calls, which worked pretty well. They're a great way to hop in and sort of rapid fire Q&A with me. They're really helpful if you're like, I really just need to talk through this idea I have. Can I buy an hour of your brain? Cool. But they weren't really helping move the needle in a larger strategic fashion for, say, content calendar, content planning, even things like making decisions around rebrands and those kind of changes that might need to come in your show. It just honestly wasn't enough time. And so I decided to set those aside and instead launch a one-off strategy-focused way to sit down with me that was a little less of a commitment because there's no long-term structure like we have with production. It really is, we sit down and you're on your way. And so we launched the podcast strategy intensives. Podcast strategy intensives are a single session 2-hour call with a 45-minute follow-up, usually somewhere between 9 and 12 weeks later. It just depends on how you book it. It does have to be booked sometime in the 3 months following that initial call. What we do is we sit down together and we map out at least 12 weeks of content. It's funny, when I first started selling this, I said, we'll map out 12 weeks of content. Like that's the goal. We haven't had a single session where we didn't map out at least 15 weeks of content because it just rolled really well. And at this point, done follow-ups that supplied at least another 6 to 8 weeks of content ideas in the follow-up. So you're going to get lots of content planning in this. But the work actually starts a little bit before the call. And so that's why I want to start with, what does actually buying this look like? Now, this is something that we have on the site. You can go and you can book at any time when it's open. I try to always have the link available as long as I know when next I'm going to have the capacity to open them. But they're not open every month. You won't always be able to go and find a spot right then. So when you head over to the website, uncommonlymore.com/intensive, and you go to book your podcast strategy intensive, you're going to want to find whatever the next available sessions is. As of recording this, we do have sessions available in the next 30 days. But anytime you're thinking about doing one of these, just head over and you'll be able to see exactly when the next available sessions are. Because our podcast production clients have standard times each year where essentially they sit down with us and do this kind of work. And so we have to be mindful of my capacity when we're doing these. And so in the months that we have production quarterly calls, we do not have podcast strategy intensive standalone calls because I would lose my mind. So head on over, look and see what's next available. Again, as of the time we release this, we do have these available in the next 30 days. So this is a good time to jump in if this sounds good right now. When you do that, you will book and pay all in one place. I do occasionally get questions about payment plans. And if that is something that would be nice for you, make this easier, whatever, if you go all the way to the bottom of that page, you'll see some FAQs listed, just a few of them. And one of them is there a payment plan? If you click on that, there's actually a button in there to reach out. Just let me know what payment structure you would like. You don't get anything you don't ask for. And we can get it booked. The only sort of caveat to this is we do require full payment before the actual session. And if you want to talk to me before you actually book, maybe you have some one-on-one specific questions, cool. Right under that, in that same FAQ area, is a can we talk before I book? I have questions. And inside of there, you will see, again, a link to sit down and book a 15-minute call with me. Easy breezy. So let's get those right out of the way. Also, if you have questions and you're like, I don't actually need to talk to you, but I just have questions, DM me on Instagram. Send me a message on LinkedIn. Drop me an email. Fill out the contact form on the website. You don't get anything you don't ask for. I will say it over and over again. So reach out. Let me know your questions. I always want to be able to answer those for you. And I always want you to have all of them answered before you decide whether this is a fit. But hopefully our conversation today will help answer a lot of those questions. That is what it is built to do. So you go in, you book, you're good. What happens next? You will fill out a form where you're going to leave me a couple of pieces. And I'm actually going to walk you through the questions on that form right now so that you know exactly what information you need to have together before you book your call. The intro is simple enough, everything you'd expect, first name, last name, phone number, email, website, those kind of things. Then we start digging into some information that I need to have for nuance, context, all of those lovely things. So we talk about what you do, who you work with. The more information you can give me here about who you want to be working with and who you don't want to be working with, the better. Then we start talking about what are we selling. So what are you selling in the next 12 weeks? Who are you selling it to? Let's talk about the nuance in that question from the ideal client question, right? Ideal client might be more general. This is the client archetype we work with. But who are we selling to might be more specific. Inside of that archetype, here is where they're at. Because for a lot of us, we have multiple offers who are a better fit for different clients. Let's use me as an example for the sake of transparency and for the sake of this being easier for you to understand how to be ready. Our ideal clients are absolutely podcasters like you who are using their show to hopefully generate and convert leads for their business. You are your sponsor for all intent and purposes. So you need to be generating some kind of return on the time, energy, and possibly financial investment you are making with your show. And that's going to come from something you sell, not just running an ad for someone else, a third party on your show. That's who we work with. These people are usually coaches, consultants, service providers, and they are really firm in their understanding that they are people who work with people, and they want to be creating a space where those people can get the information they need before they raise their hand, before they reach out, so that they can come to those conversations ready to take action. Now, the who are we selling to, if we talk about the next 12 weeks and let's say we're selling this podcast strategy intensive, that's going to look a little different than if for the next 12 weeks we're selling podcast production. Generally, for our production clients, they're people who have been in their show for 1-2 years, and they have a really good understanding of where their show fits in, the results they deliver, and kind of what they want from their show next. And they're ready to commit to 12 months of production support with our team. That's not necessarily where our podcast strategy intensive clients are. For our intensive, generally they're new, maybe even in their first year of podcasting still, and they're still trying to figure out the right way to do this for themselves. Maybe they're still trying to find their voice. They're still trying to figure out where the holes are in their content, where the holes are in their messaging even, and they're not really clear on how their show yet fills a sales asset, sales tool kind of role. Right now, it's very much still just feeling like content for the sake of content. And they're not quite ready to make a big commitment because they're not totally sure they're going to be doing their show 12 months from now. And so when we sit down for a podcast strategy intensive, one, we kind of help them realize how their show could be structured. We kind of start to figure out what good could be coming from their show with, honestly, usually some 1% changes, not massive shifts. And that's a difference. So when you're looking at not just your ideal client, but who are you selling to now? Who is this specific offer? What are the nuances of this offer that you're selling? What are the nuances in that ideal client specific to this offer? We see this a lot when we're somebody who is selling a service, and we have a sort of done for you, a done with you, and a I'll teach you how to do it yourself, sort of 3 levels of offers. They may all be the same general ideal client, but where they are in their journey and their needs are going to be different depending on each of those offers. And so keep in mind, again, those specifics and those nuances of where your ideal clients are when they're ready for this specific offering. We're also going to wrap up our form with when and how are you selling it? So what are the dates of that sales cycle? Do we need to be filling a webinar or a workshop as part of the pre-sale process? And oh, by the way, how are you selling it? Is this a click to buy? because they're going to need a whole lot more information on the show if it's a click to buy than if we're in a sales call conversation. And if it's a high dollar offer, you're going to really want to make sure you have some assets in place that help them understand what's going to happen, what the value is, why it's relevant to them. Kind of like this episode, where you can, in fact, click to buy a podcast strategy intensive, which is not an insignificant investment. It is a high dollar service, a high value offer, however you want to frame that. I don't like any of that language, honestly, but it's an investment. This is a big deal because we're going to create some real shifts and some real change in how you create content right now. And so I want to make sure that you have absolutely all the information you could need so that you can come to me with any questions that are left, because you're going to know what questions are the right questions, because any questions left after you have today, you need to bring them to me. Because there's not a whole lot left that you could be asking about. Anything else is going to be really specific to you. And so I want you to raise your hand and I want you to say, hey, Stace, tell me what's up. Is this going to be helpful for me? Here's what I need to know. We're also going to ask for a link to your most recent episode. That's the easy one. And here's the tricky one. A link to the episode you consider your best sales asset. And I will say probably 50% of the people who we've done podcast strategy intensives with so far didn't have an episode to link there. They're like, I don't know that I have one of these. Maybe this. That's cool. That's just going to help me have a really good focus for the first episode that I want you to be producing in that next 12 weeks of content, which is going to be any kind of sales asset. But the reason I ask for this also is if you have what you consider a good sales asset for the thing you're already selling, it's going to allow me to really be coming in with some strategic motions forward, because we can make tweaks to this thing you already have, which means we are starting ahead of the curve and we can do a lot more. On the flip side, if you don't have any sales assets yet, cool, then I know some low-hanging fruit we need to be checking boxes for right now. Easy breezy. Either way, it's going to give us a jump start on where to prioritize our time, a direction for us to start from. The last thing on this form is any questions you know you have right now that you want us to answer on our call. So a great example of some of the ones we've had so far are, should I rebrand my show? Should I keep having guests on my show? Do I need a co-host with one of them? Should I shift to seasons from evergreen? This was a big one that came up in conversations as we wrapped up last year. I think that's it. Those are some of the big ones. The rebrand one is another really big one. Is now the right time for a rebrand? Do I need to rebrand? Do I need to end this show and start a new show? And then we've had a couple people who have came on where they wanted to launch a show and they weren't ready to commit to 12 months of production because they wanted to just map out 12 weeks and do a season and be like, cool, I want to have a strategic season. Whatever comes of this, I'll have 12 to 15 really solid sales assets, whether I continue on as a podcaster or not. But I don't want to invest in production for that. I just want to make sure I have a strategy for this experiment so that we're really setting this experiment up for success from the beginning. So that's the form you'll fill out. It'll happen right when you book, easy breezy. I will get that, and then I will take that information, and before our call, I will go through and I will do an audit. Not dissimilar from the audits that we do over on the newsroom, except in full disclosure, a bit more robust. So I am looking at those 2 episodes you left me. I'm generally listening to a few other episodes. I'm looking at the overall feed. I'm reading the description. I'm checking out the cover art. I'm looking at your social platforms to see the tools you're using to promote your episode, the kind of language you're using. I'm looking at the show notes on your website to make sure they are set up for success, to make sure they are set up to do what you want them to do. They're set up to support you and work for you and drive the results you want to be driving. Before that call even starts, I'm working inside of a Google Doc to create a checklist, a starting point for you to be working through. It really is sort of a podcast to-do list, right? Recommendations about your description. Some of this is going to be based on the questions you leave me, the feedback in the forum. If you have questions about a rebrand, I'm going to start addressing some of that rebrand stuff in there. So we'll have that doc started before we even start. In about, and these are, me pulling percentages sort of roughly, back of my hand math, not even a napkin, my hand math. Probably 75-ish% of the podcast strategy intensives we've done, I had episode ideas started already. So like based on the sales assets you sent me or didn't send me, based on the episodes I see in the feed so far, here are the episodes I want to see us get started with. Here are some things that I want to have in place. And then we hop in that 2-hour call. We start that call by going through that checklist. We start that call by going through the audit I've done so far, because this is going to be a really big priority. I want your feedback on these things. I want us to make sure that these changes are going to be driving us in the direction you want to be going with your show. And a lot of times we end up fleshing out some of that audit stuff based on questions I'll have, based on what I've consumed so far. So we're going to work through that together, and then we're going to dig right into working on some strategy stuff and putting together that content plan. What I love about our time together is we're able to generally roughly title and outline at least 12 episodes, oftentimes 15 or even 20 episodes, depending on how we get through it and how we get clipped to going together. I always try and focus on setting you up to a point in which you can take what we have created in that Google Doc and literally just sit down and start doing stuff, whether that is recording episodes or making changes to your where your show's actually, your destinations, where your show's actually distributed to. Some of the stuff we talk about in that end of the year episode where we talk about your end of the year review, a lot of that stuff is what we're doing in our audits, regardless of the time of year that we do the audit, because those are the things we look at first when we bring on production clients. So this podcast strategy intensive is essentially a production kickoff call. Our first call with our production clients happens exactly the same way as our podcast strategy intensives do, except instead of happening in a Google Doc like it does on the intensive, our production clients are in our Monday.com dashboards that we customize for them. That's it. That's the difference between the two calls. So this is a really good place to get a firm, actionable plan for your next 12 weeks of content. But what happens after that call? After that call, you get the Google Doc. You do get a call recording from the day. I try to do video in case there's anything I've shared on the screen during the time. I have our audit the doc up and stuff like that. So I try to share the video. It just depends. But you'll have that, and you'll get a link to book your follow-up call. Again, that happens usually 6, 9, at the most 12 weeks later, and it is a 45-minute follow-up. The difference between the follow-up and that initial call is that follow-up does not have any structure that I dictate. That 45-minute call is for you to, A, debrief any changes you've made and the impact they've had so far, what has felt good and what has felt hard in executing that plan, that strategy, what we cooked up in your intensive, and any questions that have come from what you've done so far. In almost all of our follow-up calls, we've been able to map out additional episodes so that they can start rolling into when they have completed the episodes that they have done, that they had mapped out in our initial call. Because there'll be some clarity around, oh, I did this episode and I actually figured out that we could do this, this, and this. Cool. What do those look like? Let's map them out a little bit. Let's start to flesh them out a little bit. So that second 45-minute call is sort of a mini, almost rapid fire version of that first 2-hour call. That call, after we're done, also gets uploaded to your Drive folder with your doc and with your first call, and those are yours to keep. You can download them. You can keep them on your side. Those are for you. That way you can be revisiting that stuff. If you want to do your next quarter on your own, you can sort of work through the conversation we had and see if there was anything you missed, anything you didn't action on, anything you want to take further. Or You can book another one with me and we can do the same thing all over again. And that structure would be exactly the same. We've had a couple of people already book their second intensive with me because that feels like an easier lift than shifting their production. Maybe they're already working with some freelancers. Maybe they're perfectly content DIYing their show. In some cases, they have somebody in their life who can do their editing and things like that. And that's a much smaller financial lift, but they don't have any place they can get the strategic support. So this container is exactly that. It's just the strategy part so that you can hit the ground running when it comes to the actual production of your show. And that's it. That's the podcast strategy intensives. These are a great fit for somebody who's just looking for some strategic support in creating sales assets instead of another quarter, 6 months, or even year of content because they swore they were going to release episodes more consistently. And they're just not ever quite sure what to say. I don't want you to be in that position. So that's why these exist. Before I let you go, I want to tell you a little bit. I want you to hear from a couple of people who have been through podcast strategy intensives with me. These were a couple of people who raised their hand when we did the initial stress test for this offer. So they have been completely through this with me. And I'm so grateful that they shared this thought. Diane, who is actually going to be a podcast audit for us as well over on the newsroom, so stay tuned for that, shared this. Quote, "There are plenty of coaches and consultants who will help you launch a podcast, but who do you turn to when you have an established show that just isn't performing optimally? Well, if you're an expert or small business owner and your podcast is your primary marketing asset, you turn to Stacey Harris and Uncommonly More. I really needed a strategic advisor to help me think through whether to rebrand and create a roadmap for implementing it. Stacey's podcast strategy intensive was the perfect solution. Effective, efficient, and fun. She specializes in producing shows just like mine, so I knew it would be just what I needed, and it was. I have a clear direction, a timeline, and a plan of action. Highly recommend." Thank you, Diane. I love that you really highlighted the implementation piece of this because listen, I built social media strategies for a while before we launched the agency. And honestly, it's part of the reason we launched the agency because I was really frustrated building these strategies and watching them just gather digital dust in Dropbox or Drive or wherever the client had stored them because they felt too big to implement themselves. And so every piece of this intensive is really built to make implementation a natural and easy next step because your show is a whole lot easier to produce when it doesn't feel like a huge lift to get it done. And so that's why these are built. So thank you, Diane, for pointing that out. The other one is Shannon Baker of the Mind Your Time podcast. She says, and again, a quote, "I was not disappointed after the podcast intensive with Stacey. I've been struggling to figure out how to put all the pieces together, my podcast, my membership, and how to incorporate a private podcast into my marketing. Stacey helped me outline everything based on my expertise and plan out 3 months of content. We actually planned out a little more than that, which I was not able to do on my own. Now I am more confident that my podcast will provide even more value when I relaunch. Even better, it will help me to generate more leads, close more sales with less effort, and grow my membership," end quote. Thank you, Shannon, for that. Again, a shining example of implementation. I actually want to point you to another episode now. I had Shannon on the show. I will link it in the show notes here because Shannon talks about our time together and had some big time implementation. And was such a great example of what can come out of these calls because she got a lot of clarity and I'm so thrilled about it. So if you want to read these, if you want to see more testimonials like this, head over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive. You can read those there. You can read through kind of what I've shared today. And best of all, you can book your call right there and we can get your intensive on the books. Like I said, I do have calls available in these next 30 days. And then we will take a bit of a break for our production clients, quarterly calls, and then we will open them back up again as we start to hit spring. So if you have questions, get the answer. Reach out to me on Instagram. Send me an email. Whatever it is that will make it easiest for you. And by all means, book your call. Let's get you on the calendar. I can't wait. Again, uncommonlymore.com/intensive. And I will see you again next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.